There's a unique kind of vulnerability that comes with living in a city. You're surrounded by millions of people, yet you can feel utterly alone. You build walls, not just physical ones in your apartment, but mental ones too. You learn to ignore the muffled arguments from next door, the footsteps in the hall, the distant sirens that are the city's lullaby. You convince yourself that your space is sacred, that when you close and lock your door, you're shutting the world out. But you never really are. The truth is, you're just living in a box next to other boxes, stacked on top of more boxes. And some walls are made of glass. I learned this lesson in apartment 4B, a place I once called my sanctuary, but which became my stage. I had moved for the usual reasons. A bad breakup, a dead-end job, the desperate need for a fresh start somewhere. No one knew my name or the ghost of my past relationship. The building was old, one of those pre-war constructions with charming flaws, creaky hardwood floors, a temperamental radiator, and a beautiful, almost tragically romantic central courtyard. The apartments were arranged in a U-shape around this patch of neglected green. It was supposed to be a shared space, but it was always empty. Home only to a dying oak tree and a collection of rainwater in a cracked stone bird bath. From my fourth-floor living room window, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the apartments directly across the courtyard. And they, in turn, had a perfect, unobstructed view of me. At the time, this architectural feature seemed quaint. It fostered a sense of community, I naively thought. The first week was a blur of unpacking boxes, ordering takeout, and trying to establish a new routine. I worked from home as a graphic designer, so my apartment was my entire world. I spent most of my days at my desk, which I'd positioned by the large window to get the best natural light. It was on the third or fourth day that I first noticed him. It wasn't an event, just a flicker of awareness. As I looked up from my screen to rest my eyes, my gaze drifted across the courtyard to the window directly opposite mine. There was a figure there, a dark shape against the dim interior of the room, a silhouette of a man standing perfectly still. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. I blinked, and my mind quickly rationalized it. People look out their windows. It's normal. I was the new resident. Maybe he was just curious. I gave a small, hesitant wave, a friendly gesture. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. After a few awkward seconds, I felt a flush of embarrassment and quickly looked away, focusing back on the pixelated glow of my monitor. But it kept happening. Every time I looked up, he was there. Morning, noon, and as dusk began to bleed into the sky, his silhouette would be framed in that window. A silent, motionless sentinel. My initial nonchalance began to curdle into a persistent, low-grade anxiety. I never saw his face. The light was always behind him, casting him in perpetual shadow. I only knew he was a man by his general shape, broad shoulders, short hair. He was just there, always. I started to tell myself stories to make it less creepy. Maybe he was an artist, using the window for inspiration. Maybe he was an invalid, unable to leave his apartment, and the window was his only connection to the outside world. A lonely old man, perhaps? This thought made me feel pity instead of fear, which was a welcome relief. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being self-centered, that the world didn't revolve around me and my window. But it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a constant, invisible pressure on my skin. I began to close my blinds a little, earlier each day, sacrificing the beautiful afternoon light for a sliver of privacy. Yet I couldn't resist peeking through the slats, my heart thumping a little faster each time. And each time, the confirmation was there. The dark shape, patiently, waiting. The shift happened on a Tuesday. It was subtle, so small I was certain I had imagined it. I had bought a small fern to bring some life into the apartment and had placed it on the corner of my windowsill. I spent a minute adjusting it, turning it so the leaves caught the light. Just right. Later that evening, as I was drawing the curtains for the night, my eyes automatically shot across the courtyard. His window was dark, but not completely. A faint light from within his apartment cast a soft glow, and on his windowsill, in the exact same corner as mine, sat a plant, a small leafy silhouette that hadn't been there that morning. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pricked at the base of my neck. No, it was a coincidence, a ridiculous, absurd coincidence. Lots of people own plants. It meant nothing. I repeated it to myself like a mantra until I almost believed it. Can't unsee something like that. The seed of a truly terrifying thought had been planted. The next day, I decided to test it. My hands were trembling, and I felt like a fool, like a character in a horror movie making a stupid decision. But I had to know. Around midday, I took a bright yellow scarf I owned and deliberately draped it over the back of my desk chair, making sure it was clearly visible from the window. Then I sat, pretending to work, my entire being focused on the window across the way. For an hour, nothing. The silhouette stood there, unchanging. I started to relax, a wave of relief washing over me. I was being paranoid. I was the creepy one, staring at a neighbor and inventing sinister narratives. I let out a shaky breath and turned my full attention back to my work, truly focused for the first time all day. It was almost 4 p.m. when I stood up to stretch. My eyes, of their own accord, darted across the courtyard, and my blood ran cold. Draped over the back of a chair I could now just barely make out behind a silhouette was a splash of color. A bright, unmistakable yellow. It wasn't just a similar color. It was the exact same shade. My scarf, but in his apartment, stopped my breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. This was a performance. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt violated, exposed. My safe space, my new beginning, had been breached in the most insidious way possible. How long had this been going on? Had I been copying other things, small things? I hadn't noticed. The way I made my coffee, the time I went to bed. My home was no longer a home. It was a terrarium. And he was on the other side of the glass, watching and learning. That night, I didn't just close my curtains. I pulled my desk away from the window, moved my chair, and sat in the darkest corner of my living room, imagining his silhouette across the courtyard, standing in the dark, waiting. But what was he waiting for? The terror was no longer in what I could see. It was in the unanswered question of what he would do next. The next morning, I knew I had to test it one last time, a final, definitive act to confirm my sanity or condemn. End to this waking nightmare. I walked into my kitchen, my movements stiff with fear, and poured a glass of water. I stood in full view of the window, raised the glass to my lips, and drank, my eyes locked on his window. The silhouette didn't move. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but that terrifying stillness. Then, with a slowness that felt deliberate, mocking, the silhouette detached from the window frame. It stepped back into the shadows of its room, disappearing from my sight. My relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. I had been wrong. It was all in my head. I let out a choked laugh. And then he reappeared. He stepped back into the frame, and he raised his hand to his mouth, mimicking the exact motion of drinking from a glass. In his hand, there was nothing. He was just acting it out. A perfect, silent, horrifying pantomime of my last action. My scream was trapped in my throat. He wasn't just watching me. He wasn't just copying me. He was showing me that he was. He wanted me to know. The silence that followed his pantomime was more terrifying than any scream. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the glass of water still in my hand, my own reflection pale and distorted on its surface. He remained at his window for another minute, a statue of pure malice, before retreating back into the blackness of his apartment, leaving me alone with the echoing reality of what had just happened. My first instinct was to call the police, but my hand hovered over my phone, useless. What would I say? My neighbor? He's copying me. He pretends to drink water when I do. I could hear the tired, dismissive voice on the other end of the line. They would send someone, maybe. A patrol car would circle the block. They'd knock on his door. He wouldn't answer, or he'd answer and be perfectly normal. A charming man confused by the accusations of his hysterical new neighbor. I would be labeled the crazy one, the troublemaker. The thought paralyzed me more than the fear itself. I was utterly, completely alone in this. He knew it. This was why he was being so careful. His torment was perfectly calibrated to be unbelievable to anyone but me. My apartment, once a symbol of my independence, became a cage of my own making. I taped blackout cloths over the windows, plunging my life into an artificial twilight. But it didn't help. The darkness didn't feel like a shield. It felt like I was joining him in his world. I started to imagine I could feel his gaze through the concrete and brick, a psychic pressure that left me perpetually on edge. Every creak of the old building was him. The whisper of the wind through the courtyard was him. I stopped working. My clients' emails went unanswered. Their calls went to voicemail. How could I design logos and websites when the very architecture of my reality was being dismantled? My life shrank to the four walls of my apartment, and even within them, I was a prisoner. I'd eat standing up in the kitchen quickly, as if to make myself a smaller target. I'd sleep on the sofa, far from the bedroom window, wrapped in a blanket like a child hiding from monsters. But the monster wasn't under the bed. He was across the courtyard, and his influence was seeping into everything. Days bled into one another in a sleepless, paranoid haze. And a strange, horrifying shift began to occur within me. My fear, still potent, was now mingled with a burning, obsessive curiosity. The terror had carved out a hollow space inside me, and obsession was rushing in to fill it. Who was he? What did he want? Was this a game? A punishment? A prelude to something worse? The need to understand became more powerful than the need to hide. I started watching him back. I'd cut a tiny peephole in the blackout cloth and spent hours pressed against the glass, my eye aching, trying to glean any detail from the void of his apartment. It was a reversal of our initial dynamic. I was now the watcher, the voyeur, desperately seeking a crack in his shadowy facade. But he was a professional. He revealed nothing. His window remained a dark canvas. The silhouette would appear, stand for hours, and disappear. No TV flicker, no other people, no sound. It was as if he didn't exist outside of his relationship with me. It was maddening. My entire existence became a feedback loop of fear and observation. I was no longer living a life. I was studying his imitation of it, and then he escalated. He broke the rules of the game. He started to move first. It began with small things. I would feel a pang of hunger and think about going to the kitchen. And as the thought formed, I would see his silhouette move away from the window toward the back of his own apartment. A minute later, he would return, just as I was opening my own refrigerator. He was no longer just a mirror. A mirror reflects what is. He was starting to reflect what was about to be. One evening, I was feeling a chill and thought about grabbing the sweater from my bedroom. Before I could even stand up, I glanced through my peephole. His silhouette turned and walked out of view. A moment later, it returned, and I could just make out that it was pulling something over its shoulders. He was anticipating my thoughts. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was impossible. I was projecting. I was so sleep deprived and terrified that I was manufacturing patterns. But the animal part of me, the part that knew the feeling of a predator's gaze, knew the truth. The line between his mind and mine was blurring, and I didn't know which way the influence was flowing. Was he reading my mind? Or was he planting thoughts in it? The question was so terrifying, I couldn't bear to dwell on it. I knew I had to break the cycle. I had to do something completely random, something so out of character for my new, hermetic life that he couldn't possibly predict it. One afternoon, in a surge of adrenaline-fueled desperation, I ripped the cloth from my window. I blinked in, the sudden, painful sunlight. I didn't look across the courtyard. I didn't want to see him. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my jacket, and I ran. I didn't bother to lock the door. I just ran out of the apartment, down the 4 flights of stairs, my footsteps echoing wildly in the silent building. I burst out onto the street, gasping in the cold, crisp air. The noise of the city, the traffic, the chatter of people walking by, it was overwhelming, but it was real. It was life. I felt a surge of triumphant relief. I had escaped. I had broken the pattern. I put a block between myself and him, walking fast, turning a corner, then another. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a phantom limb of my former. Terror dot after about 20 minutes of aimless walking, my breathing slowed, and the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, shaking chill. I found myself on a street corner that looked back towards my building. From this distance, it looked so normal. Just another brick building on another city block. I could see my window. And a wave of nausea washed over me. I had to see. I needed the final confirmation that I was free. I stood there, half hiding behind a newspaper stand, and I watched. My apartment light was still on. I had left it on in my haste. And across the courtyard, in his window, a light was also on. A single pale light mirroring mine. I watched, my heart beginning to thump its old, fearful rhythm. This was the moment. He had to be confused. His subject had left the stage. The play was over. What would he do? And then it happened. The light in my apartment clicked off. I stared, uncomprehending. I was standing on a street corner, miles away. It was impossible. And then, a heartbeat later, as if on a celestial timer, his light clicked off too, plunging both windows into an identical, consuming darkness. A scream, thin and ragged, finally escaped my lips. He hadn't followed me. He hadn't needed to. He knew my routine so perfectly, had internalized my patterns so completely that he could continue the performance without me. He wasn't mimicking me, the person. He was mimicking the occupant of apartment 4B. He had become my ghost. I hadn't escaped my prison. I had just locked myself out of it. And he was still inside, living my life in the dark. Standing on that cold, indifferent street corner, the city lights blurring through the tears welling in my eyes, I understood the true nature of my prison. It wasn't the apartment. It was the uncheckable knowledge of him. To run would be useless. I could move to another city, another country, and I would spend the rest of my life peering out of windows, searching for a silent silhouette, flinching at every strange coincidence. I would be forever looking over my shoulder for a ghost that I had willingly abandoned my life to. He hadn't just taken over my apartment. He had taken over my future, seeding it with a paranoia that would grow like a cancer. There was no escape. The only path was back through the darkness, back up those 4 flights of stairs, and back into the cage to face the zookeeper. The walk back was a funeral march. Every person I passed was a potential accomplice, every dark alleyway a trap. The world, which had felt so vibrant and real just minutes before, now seemed like a flimsy stage set, and I could feel his directorial gaze from his perch across the courtyard, anticipating my return. The entrance to my building loomed like the mouth of a tomb. The air inside was cold, stagnant, and silent, but it was a heavy, listening silence. I could feel his awareness of my presence in the building's very foundation. My footsteps on the stairs, which I had run down in a panic, were now slow, deliberate, each one a concession of defeat. When I reached the door to 4B, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just as I had left it. A sliver of blackness from my unlit apartment beckoned me. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my hand immediately finding the wall switch. The light flickered on, flooding the room with a harsh, clinical glare. The sight of my own living room was jarring. It was both intimately familiar and deeply alien. It was a place where I had lived, but now it felt like a museum of a life that was no longer mine, a crime scene. I did a slow, methodical sweep of the small space. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, everything was exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of a physical intruder, but his presence was everywhere. It was in the oppressive stillness of the air and the way the shadows clung to the corners. He hadn't needed to enter my apartment. He had already owned it. I stood in the center of the room, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. What now? Would we simply resume the game, me hiding behind my curtains while he stood his silent vigil? No, I couldn't. The suspense, the not knowing, was a poison that had run its course. Whatever was to happen, it would happen now. On my terms, in a final, defiant act, I walked to the window. My hands, surprisingly steady, took hold of the blackout cloth I had so desperately hung for protection. With one violent tug, I ripped it down. The window, which I had treated as an enemy portal, was now just a pane of glass, streaked with city grime. Across the courtyard, his window was a black, inscrutable square. A void. I stood there, fully illuminated in my own window, an open invitation, a challenge. I stared into that darkness, my eyes unblinking, trying to will him into existence. For minutes that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing. The silence was absolute. Maybe he was gone. Maybe my escape, however brief, had broken his obsession. A fragile, foolish hope began to flutter in my chest. And then a light clicked on in his apartment. It wasn't the dim, ghostly glow from before. It was a bright, clear light, identical to the one in my own living room. The darkness in his window resolved into a room. And for the first time, I saw him. Not the silhouette, but the man. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from a profound, soul-shattering shock. He was normal. Agonizingly, terrifyingly normal. He was perhaps in his late 40s, with thinning hair, glasses, and a plain gray sweater. There were no horns, no fangs, no monstrous features. He was the kind of man you'd pass on the street and forget instantly. But it wasn't him that held my gaze. It was his room. It was my room. It was an exact, painstaking replica. The same cheap, flat-pack bookshelf from IKEA. The same faded blue rug I'd found at a flea market. The same small, wilting fern on the windowsill. And on his walls, where I had hung cheap art prints, he had hung photographs. Dozens of them. Photographs of me. Me asleep on the sofa, mouth agape. Me at my desk, frustration etched on my face. Me crying, my body curled into a ball. Every moment of my private joy and private suffering, captured and displayed like trophies. He didn't look at me. He seemed completely unaware of my gaze. He moved with a calm deliberateness to a desk that was identical to mine, in the identical position by the window. He sat down in a chair that was a mirror image of my own. He wasn't watching me anymore. He was ignoring me. What was this? What was the new game? I watched, mesmerized by the sheer, insane audacity of it all. He leaned forward, his hands poised over a keyboard I couldn't see, and he began to type. His fingers moved with a steady, rhythmic cadence. He was a writer, a creator. And in that moment, the final terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a soundless, devastating snap. The premonitions, the feeling that he was anticipating my actions, it wasn't a psychic connection. It wasn't him reading my mind. It was so much worse. He wasn't copying my past. He had been writing my future. My sudden decision to test him with the scarf, my growing paranoia, my desperate, unpredictable flight from the apartment, none of it was mine. It was all his. He had written the scene, and I, his perfect, unknowing actress, had played my part flawlessly. He wasn't a mirror. He was a god. A cruel, bored god, and this apartment was his terrarium, and I was his subject. My life wasn't my own. It was a story he was writing, sentence by horrifying sentence. He stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking ceased. And then, with an unbearable slowness, he lifted his head and looked directly at me. His eyes met mine through the 2 panes of glass that separated our identical rooms. There was no anger, no madness in his expression. There was only the calm, satisfied look of an artist appraising his work. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He lifted his hands from his keyboard, and he began to pantomime the act of typing in the air. Tap, tap, tap. The movements were slow, deliberate, mocking. It was the same gesture as the pantomimed glass of water, the same silent, horrific communication. He was showing me what he was doing. He was telling me that this moment, right now, was being written. That my terror, my realization, my frozen stance at the window were all part of his script. And as I stared at his mime typing, I felt a strange, terrifying impulse rise within me, an electrical tingling in my own fingers, a desire, not my own, to move my own hands to my own keyboard, to continue the story. The realization was a final internal scream that had no sound. Who was I? Was the thought I was having right now truly mine? Or was it just the next line of dialogue he had written for his character? The observer had become the author, and the author had erased his subject. I stood there, a puppet whose strings were now visible, trapped not by walls or by a watcher, but by the very narrative of my own existence. The story of the woman in apartment 4B was still being written, and I had no idea how he planned for it to end. Asterisk.